Wheel.com, and over the years I've reviewed a lot of different humidors in all shapes and sizes, but when it comes to traditional desktop humidors like the ones you see in front of me, most of the desktop humidors I have reviewed have been in the $400 to $600 price point, which is basically the upper middle class of desktop humidors. And so for my next review, or as it turns out my next 7 reviews, I wanted to see if there was a cheaper or cheap humidor that actually works that I would recommend. And I specifically started looking to see if I could find a $100 humidor that advertises holding 100 cigars, that was a traditional wooden humidor, so no plastic, that would work. And I quickly realized that probably wasn't going to happen. So I ended up changing those qualifications a little bit and bought 7 humidors that all meet basically 3 requirements. The first is they got to look like a traditional desktop humidor. So there's no plastic, there's no acrylic humidors, there's no converted coolers. They got to be things that you would think of when you think of a humidor. The second is that they need to hold at least 50 Robustos, and not the advertised number. They needed to be capable of legitimately holding it without any humidor Tetris. 50 cigars, normal size cigars, quite easily, of which I think all of these do. And the third was that there was a hard price limit of $175 before tax or shipping. Now, I will point out some of these humidors were bought on sale, but I also think some of these humidors are on sale year-round. So whatever the case is, you should be able to, with a little bit of research, find any of the 7 humidors that are being reviewed as part of the series for less than $175. So this is the second of the humidors for this series. This is the Prestige Princeton from Prestige Import Group. It cost $134.55 before tax and shipping. Now, one note, this is the Bubinga wood option. There is also an ebony wood that's darker than this, but if you're looking at this and then you go searching for this on the internet, you will likely see pictures that show a humidor that's a lot more yellow in color. It really is brown in person. I was a bit surprised to see the stock images. I presume they're from Prestige Import Group, but just a note, this is more brown than it is yellow, despite what the pictures on the internet otherwise might tell you. If you've not heard of Prestige Import Group, that's also not terribly surprising if you're a consumer. It is one of 2 companies, along with Quality Importers Trading Company, that are really in a specific business model where they import a lot of humidors from China exclusively, or maybe primarily from China. This humidor is from China, that are bang for the buck humidors. They range from travel humidors all the way up to double cabinet door style humidors that I could walk inside of, and they really are about trying to give you the most amount of humidor for the money. There are other companies that make humidors in China that are trying to go for more of a quality aspect. I don't mean that disparaging towards prestige and quality, but they really are trying to give you the most amount of humidor, usually the largest humidor with the most amount of features for the money. And this is a 140 count, or advertises 140 count humidor for $135, and you can kind of see that price to size matrix there, really working in Prestige's favor. In terms of the specific dimensions, it is 15 inches wide, it's 9.8 inches deep, and then it is 6.5 inches on the outside from here to here. Like I said, this is one of 2 different color options. There's also a darker ebony wood option. I've not seen it in person, so I don't know if the ebony one looks that much different in person like the Bubinga one does, but this is it. It's a pretty standard humidor. You can see up front it's got a keyhole, and then it's got sort of a modern accent piece to help you open up the lid. There is nothing on the sides. There is no external hygrometer. There's nothing else. There's some felt on the bottom, but otherwise it is a very sort of classic humidor. When I open it up, you can see that it comes with an included humidifier and an included hygrometer. This is an analog hygrometer. This is a Florist foam humidifier. I'll get to that more in a second. The entire lid is magnetic, which is a nice feature and something that I think all humidors at this point should be having, so you can slide these things around however you wish. This is one of the few humidors in this testing of sub $175 humidors that comes with a tray with a divider inside of it. Interestingly enough, there's no divider on the bottom of the humidor, which seems like a pretty decent oversight. That it would be a lot more useful if there was a divider down here than in the tray. In terms of the interior dimensions, it is 13.5 inches wide from the inside to the other piece of the inside, 8.5 inches from here to here, and then it's 4.75 inches from the bottom of the humidor to this piece right here. There's probably about another 1/2 inch of usable space in the lid, so if you remove the included accessories and you just wanted to stack as many cigars as you can, I think you could probably get them to go maybe to about there-ish before they would get crushed by the lid. You could fit 140 cigars in here if you really tried with some humidor Tetris. I wouldn't recommend it, but I do think you could easily store 100 cigars in this humidor. All right, so because I'm testing 7 humidors, I decided to come up with a pretty standard or at least a uniform testing protocol that I felt like could give me a decent idea without using all these humidors for, say, 6 or 12 months to get a sense of it, but something where I could get data that would tell me, beyond just visually looking at it and opening and closing the humidors, how they might perform. So the first thing I did was I removed the included accessories. So I took these off. I then took a brand new sensor push device. This is a wireless and Bluetooth data logger that measures relative humidity and temperature and sends that to my smartphone. The advantage there is that I can leave this inside of a humidor, close the lid, and then I could both monitor what the current temperature and relative humidity is inside of the box, but I also can have it send it minute by minute over the course of many months to the smartphone and then export the data for Excel charts that you'll see in a second. So, brand new sensor push device that gets calibrated. I then took a brand new sponge and soaked it in distilled water and placed it on a small plate like this. I then took the plate and I put it inside of each humidor, like so. And then I closed the humidor and did a 2-week seasoning process. The idea with seasoning is to help the moisture penetrate the wood, so that way when you put your cigars inside of the humidor, the wood isn't sucking the humidity out of your cigars. It is a very important process. If you do not do it, it is very likely, unless you live in a super humid climate, that things will go very poorly for you and you will actually have a humidor that is destroying your cigars. There are many ways to season your humidor. This is one that I do. It's sort of a safer option versus directly applying moisture to the wood, but you should use whatever method you prefer. And so after 1 week, I took the sponge out and I re-dipped it inside of a glass full of distilled water, placed it back in, and then closed it again for another 2 weeks. After that was done, I then took the sponge out and the plate that it came on, and I then filled up the included humidifier with a 50-50 solution of distilled water and propylene glycol, because it is a Florist foam humidifier, and that is what most manufacturers recommend for Florist foam. I then closed it and left it closed for 4 weeks. The idea here to test how the included humidifier does for each humidor. After the 4-week period was done, I then took out the included humidifier and I took 3 Bovedas, specifically 3 of the standard 60 gram, 69% packs, took them out of the plastic and put them in the humidor, closed it once again. I then left it for 6 weeks. The idea here was to test how well the humidors did with a sort of controlled humidity. So each humidor got 3 of the 60 gram packs, and so that way if the humidor was performing poorly, it presumably wasn't because of the included humidifier being bad, it was because of the actual box itself, which seemingly is the important part here. But if that wasn't enough, after the 6 weeks of the Bovedas was done, I took them out. I eventually learned that I should weigh the Bovedas when taking them out and when putting them in to see how much moisture was used during that 6-week period. But then I then placed each humidor inside of the box that you see on your screen right now, which is a dry cabinet. They're made for electronics. If you live in a super humid climate, a lot of photographers like to leave their equipment in here so that way the electronic pieces on it don't corrode. But the advantage here is that you can take the box and set a relative humidity, usually a lot lower than you'd like to store cigars at, but in this case, I set it to 36% relative humidity. I left each humidor inside with no humidification device inside for 2 weeks, the idea being to test how well the seals did when they were placed basically in a super dry room. I then, after that process was done, looked at all of the data via sensor push. All right, so the first piece of data we're going to look at is something that I didn't show the last time around for the first humidor in this test. And the reason was because it didn't seem so relevant. But this is the data from the seasoning. So you can see the humidor enters at about 50% relative humidity. It dips down at least for the first little while, and then it starts its slow increase. Now it spends the last week, so half of this test, at over 74.5% relative humidity for almost every hour that the sensor push was measuring. I believe it was like 6 of the however many hours that is over the course of a week where it was below 74.5, and it generally stays above 75, and it actually goes as high as 76.6 in this time period. And the reason why this data is important is because it shows that the humidor had plenty of moisture inside of it during those 2 weeks of seasoning, and particularly that it didn't seem like it was absorbing, or at least that the internal relative humidity wasn't continuing to increase at that steady of a pace, which is really what I kind of look for when trying to season a humidor with this sponge method. It's the idea that eventually the humidor is sort of gotten to a point where it's still probably absorbing moisture, but it is no longer doing it at a sort of rapid acceleration. And that leads to this next chart, which is the important part here. And you can see that the included humidifier starts at, takes over from the seasoning process at around 75-76% relative humidity. And then it just starts declining. And it almost seems like there's nothing inside of it, which is not true. There was the included humidifier. And what I think is happening here is, because it's interesting to look at the data and then compare it to the humidifier itself. And what I think is really going on is that this is a large humidor or a larger humidor, and that one of these hygrometers is not enough. Because what's interesting here is that despite the fact that it was having massive issues keeping the humidity high enough, according to the sensor push device, the hygrometer managed to mold, and it had pretty disgusting mold, which isn't surprising given that it's a Florist foam humidifier. I'll get to that more in a second, but the point there was that it was providing enough humidity to mold, but not enough humidity to actually keep the relative humidity inside of the box at the right level. And I think that you should not use the Florist foam humidifier, but if you do, you need to add, I would recommend that Prestige includes 2 of them at a minimum, because otherwise I just don't think you're going to be able to provide enough moisture. Now, if you're curious to know what a Florist foam humidifier is, here is the explanation. So if you ever ask someone how you should store your humidor, you will likely hear 70 and 70. 70% relative humidity and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is because of propylene glycol, and more specifically, propylene glycol's use in products like this. This is a Florist foam humidifier. It is the most common type of included humidification option for humidors, not just at the low end. It comes in high-end products. It comes in all different shapes and sizes, things like this. And if you open it up, what you will find is this. This is Florist foam. As the name implies, it is foam that is used by florists. What florists do is they soak this in water, and then they attach flowers to it, and they can use it to make intricate patterns and designs with the flowers while making sure that the flowers stay watered. It's been used in humidors for decades, and the way that it works, according to the manufacturers, at least most of them, is that you take your product like this, and you put a 1-to-1, a 50-50 ratio of distilled water and propylene glycol, which is sold in cigar shops as humidor solution and all sorts of other names like that. In short, if you see something, a chemical sold in a cigar shop that's labeled for your humidor, it's probably propylene glycol. And the reason behind this is because if you were to just take this and put it in distilled water like the florists do, it would release the water at a way too high of a rate. There would be nothing really restricting the amount of water that gets released. Propylene glycol has a chemical property that allows for it to restrict it, and depending on the ratio of water to propylene glycol, you can actually try to achieve a specific type of relative humidity. The problem is that 50-50, 50% distilled water, 50% propylene glycol, is not going to get anywhere close to 70% relative humidity. There's a third variable, that's the temperature, but the charts that I found from scientists, and this is way above my head, none of them got close to a temperature that made it so that you could have it at 50-50 and get to 70% relative humidity. Even if you got down to 20 degrees, it still wasn't close. And what you actually need is something that's probably closer to 2/3 propylene glycol to 1/3 distilled water to get to 70% relative humidity. And I might even go beyond that. I might even take it to maybe 80% propylene glycol to 20% distilled water. But I would just use something that wasn't invented in 1954, and the reasons behind that are these products are terribly frustrating. You will oftentimes end up with them putting out way too much moisture because there's just not really a great way to unless you're going to weigh out the propylene glycol to distilled water every time to get the 2/3 to 1/3, it's going to be a challenge. And there are problems to that. So if you over-humidify your cigars, at the very least, it probably will affect the flavor, and maybe it makes them better, but probably not. It likely will cause burn issues. Over-humidified cigars tend to not want to stay lit as well. That's why you'll hear people talk about dry boxing cigars if you have burn issues with cigars. And in the worst of instances, you run the risk of mold. So this is a Florist foam humidifier that was filled with a 50-50 ratio. And as you can see, there's now mold growing on the outside of the humidifier. And obviously, if there's mold growing there, that means that there's mold floating around your humidor, which will eventually get onto your cigars and cause you all sorts of problems. So the short of this is, don't use something that was invented in 1954 to humidify your cigar. All right, so now that that's out of the way, we turn to the Boveda data, and this was sort of the surprising part for 2 reasons. First, I was a little bit surprised that even despite the issues that were going on with the included humidifier, the Bovedas weren't able to get it close to that 69% relative humidity. I imagine that Boveda Incorporated's response to me would be to tell me that I needed to put more Boveda packs in here than 3. I would tell Boveda that there weren't any cigars in here, so that's not really a helpful explanation. But If you are going to put 140 cigars in here, Boveda would recommend that you put, what is that, 6 packs, 6 of the 60 packs in there, because it's 1 pack for every 25 cigars. The second thing that I would say that was surprising about the Bovedas is that when I took them out of the humidor after 6 weeks, they had definitely lost some moisture, but they weren't anywhere close to rock hard. They felt like they were probably about half empty, as opposed to when they completely dry out. And that seems a bit odd, given particularly that in the last 12 or so days of the Boveda test, you can see there was a pretty accelerated decline that was taking place. Now, I didn't look at this data actively while they were going through the test. That's one of the beauties of the sensor push thing. I can just wait and export all this all at once. And had I been looking at the data, I probably would have expected that the Bovedas had just dried out, beginning around 12, 15 days left, given what the chart there shows in the last quarter of the test. Now, that leads to the dry box testing, and the dry box stat is interesting because on one hand, it's not that steep of a decline. Certainly the Savoy humidor, the one that was tested for the most recent part of the series, had a steeper decline, but the Savoy came in with a much higher relative humidity. Now, the interesting thing about the Princeton humidor is that it declines about 6.5%, 7%, but which seems like it's good, and I don't know what to exactly make of it, given that it wasn't coming in with as much humidity as the Savoy. The only problem is that it gets pretty close to back to pre-seasoning levels. All right, so that's the data, but the data is not everything. So I want to give you some additional thoughts before I sort of make a recommendation on this. I did not actually put cigars in this humidor or any of the humidors that we're using for this 7 humidor test. The reason is cigars add another variable, and so I don't know how useful they are, because you put cigars in and then it's like, okay, are the cigars causing the humidor to not work, or are they helping the humidor work? So I just didn't do that. But I did spend some time playing around with the humidor and looking at it. And so I have other thoughts about it. All of them are on halfwheel.com, but in the interest of keeping these videos shorter, I'm going to give you the sort of top 3 things, bottom 3 things about the Prestige Princeton. So number 1 is the look. It's pretty universal. This is what you think of, or at least what I think of when I think of a humidor. It's got a wood exterior, and then there's just nothing glaringly wrong with it, and it seems like it could probably blend into most rooms. These pieces are silver, or at least silver plated, as opposed to gold, so it looks a little bit more modern, but it still keeps the classic look. There's nothing on the sides. There's nothing no annoying handles that bang around when you move it. There's no exterior humidifier that's going to leak humidity. So at least in terms of the looks like a humidor test, absolutely passes that 100%. The second thing I will say is that for the money, this is a very large humidor. It's not the greatest bang for the buck humidor. If you want to do that, buy a cooler or buy a Rubbermaid iris bin or a Ziploc iris bin, but if you want a sort of wooden humidor, this is a really large humidor for $135. And if you go into most cigar shops, you're probably going to find at that price point really more like travel humidors, if anything else. This is a big enough humidor where it's coming with a tray, which is just something that, like I said, it's a large humidor for $135. That's what Prestige is going for with a humidor like this, and they nailed it. The final thing I would say is that this magnetic lid is a feature that I think all humidors, regardless of price, certainly a humidor is more expensive than this, should have, but many of them do not. It's not that expensive of a feature for a manufacturer to add. It makes it so much easier because you can move around all these accessories whenever you have to, or whenever you want to add a replacement hygrometer or humidifier. You don't have to go out to the hardware store or go to Target and buy magnetic pieces to attach here. It's already there, and it just provides a much cleaner look. It also means that if you want to take any of those things down, you aren't having to scrape off the residue from adding those magnetic attachment pieces. But there are some negatives, plenty of negatives about this humidor, and it starts, ends, and really the one that should be focused on the most is attached to the lid. It's the humidifier. So this is, kind of everything that can go wrong with a Florist foam humidifier, and then some. It's got the mold, which hopefully you can see there, if I can get that to focus. So it managed to mold. It also managed to under-humidify the cigars, because one of these is not enough to humidify a box this large. And then it's got some other quirks that, you just don't particularly like to see, or at least I don't. When I was filling this up, for example, with distilled water and propylene glycol, the sort of overrun, the excess water that was coming out of it was this murky brown color that looked absolutely gross. Not something that would inspire a ton of confidence, or at least not something I'd want to then, put in a box with my cigars, and I can't imagine many people would. That's not to say that it's like the worst of the worst, the fact that the water's coming out a little bit brown, but it just isn't like the greatest looking thing in the world, not very appetizing. And so, my recommendation is, if you do buy this humidor, you should use third-party humidification, whether that be Boveda or beads or gel, something. Don't use Florist foam. If you are hell-bent on using Florist foam for whatever, you need to buy a couple more of these. I would say that probably 3 of these seems like it might be enough to supply a humidor of this size. Certainly, I would get 2 of them. There is no way, unless you live in a super humid climate, that one of them is going to work out successfully. In terms of the second issue I have with this humidor, I'm actually causing problems for it right now, and that is that whatever finish was used here is an absolute fingerprint magnet. You can't really see it on camera, fortunately. The lights sort of just blow it out, but in person, when you get up close to it, it looks like somebody ate a hamburger and then went and played with the humidor. There are fingerprints everywhere, and we have plenty of high-gloss humidors. I've owned plenty of high-gloss humidors. This doesn't feel like anything different. It just, for whatever reason, the way the fingerprints sit on that lacquer layer or whatever they're using to finish it off, they just, whatever's beneath it helps to accentuate the fingerprints, and it looks like a crime scene. So that's not great. And the third thing is something that you can see. It's right up here. The fit and finish of this humidor is not great. This is what you get at this price point when you're getting a humidor of this size. You can see right here that the seal is not perfect. Now, I would point out that unlike the last humidor I reviewed, that seems to be the wood piece, because you can see right here there's that lip that goes down there. So I don't think it's actually causing like any humidity or that much humidity to leak out, but it is visually apparent that that's not entirely flush. Speaking of flush, if I run my fingers down the sides, I can feel that the top and the bottom pieces of the humidor are not entirely aligned. You can't see it on camera, or at least I can't see it in person, so I don't think you could see it on camera. So there's that, where it's just, not something you would notice until you pick up the humidor. And then there's, other dumb things like down in here, these pieces which hold up. So there's one there, and then there's one that runs along that side that hold the tray up. Those pieces aren't remotely the same size. One of them is at least double the size of the other one. I don't know how much you honestly care about it, but it all leads to a conclusion that you didn't buy the humidor that was passing 150-point quality inspection, because it probably wasn't. So that is the sort of third problem, and it leads right into the recommendation, which is, I think that the box works, and that's really all that I'm looking for at this price point. At $175 or less, I just want to find a box that can store cigars in, that can keep the humidity in, and doesn't have any glaring issues other than that. I will deal with replacing this and replacing the included hygrometer, because chances are, at this price point, none of them are going to work. Quite frankly, even at double this price point, most of the included humidifiers and hygrometers are crap anyway. So I'm not concerned with the included accessories. The divider for the bottom piece would be nice, but other than that, I could care less. However, the data suggests that the box maybe can't humidify very well, or can't keep humidity in. I think the easiest explanation is to blame it on the humidifier and just say, look, because these tests are back to back to back to back, which means that once the 2 weeks of seasoning is done, I immediately take out the sponge. I place this in for 4 weeks. Once that's done, I take this out, place the Bovedas in. Once the Bovedas are done, I take them out, place this in the dry cabinet. Because there was no time in between, and there was no, I didn't do anything to try to correct any of the issues from the previous step, this screwed it up because there wasn't enough humidity. And then from there, everything, all the additional tests, all were screwed up beyond that. There's another explanation which says maybe the box doesn't humidify very well. It wouldn't surprise me if that was the case, but I would be more surprised than if it was just a lack of humidity from the get-go. It does feel like it humidifies well. When I open this up, you can feel, or I can feel, some suction. When you look around, or when I look around, there aren't any obvious issues. There's obviously the one up here, but it's not like the other humidor, the Savoy, where I can like literally see into the humidor. So I do think it probably seals, but I can't recommend it because the evidence would say otherwise. And if I'm going to try to have some scientific aspects or scientific testing aspects to these humidor reviews as much as I can as someone that doesn't have a degree in science, I should at least attempt to go with what the data says. And so the data says The Prestige Princeton is not going to get the seal of approval. Perhaps the next humidor in the sub $175 humidor test will. If you'd like to find out about humidors that have gotten the seal of approval, you can go to halfwheel.com and you can read plenty of other reviews about humidors, hygrometers, humidifiers, and all sorts of other cigar accessories. You can also learn more about cigars, including cigar reviews and cigar news, as well as the most comprehensive coverage of legislation on the internet. And I will be back here again in a couple of weeks to talk about another humidor, because that's apparently all of 2021.